Topic 1.9 The Slave Trade. During the early 16th century, under the rule of Charles V, King of Spain, the structured African slave trade began. Charles V issued the first license to supply Spanish colonies in the Americas with enslaved Africans around the 1500s, marking the onset of a tragic period in human history. The reduction of indigenous populations due to disease and conflict, coupled with a decreased number of indentured servants, created a high demand for labor in the American colonies. Plantation owners turned increasingly to African slave labor to meet the demands of sugar, tobacco, and coffee production, and gold mining. African leaders traded enslaved people, caught in internal conflicts, for European goods and weapons, thus fueling a cycle of violence and enslavement. In 1619, enslaved Africans arrived in North America, although the trade had been active in the West Indies and Brazil for years. Throughout this period, sustained high demand for labor perpetuated this cruel trade. Bartolomé de las Casas, a 16th century Spanish Catholic historian and friar, denounced the brutal treatment of indigenous populations and eventually African slaves, despite initially proposing the use of African slave labor as a supposed lesser evil to indigenous native labor. De las Casas later rebuked all forms of slavery. His stance against the encomienda system helped to abolish it, highlighting the severe conditions enslaved individuals endured. Between 1500 and 1800, the transatlantic slave trade operated as part of the larger triangular trade system. In this time, around 12 million Africans were forcibly relocated to North and South America to serve as slaves. The triangular trade involved three regions: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. In Europe, manufactured goods such as rifles were loaded onto ships. These ships then traveled to Africa, where the goods were exchanged for captured Africans. Next, the ships sailed to the Americas. Here, enslaved Africans were traded for raw materials like sugar, tobacco, and tea. These raw materials, high in demand in Europe, were transported back to complete this cycle. This trade system, marked by the brutal displacement of millions of Africans, facilitated the exchange of goods across the Atlantic, influencing the economies and societies of the continents involved. Understanding this trade system is vital to grasp the economic and social dynamics of the period, reflecting the interconnected commerce, forced migration, and exploitation that characterized those centuries. From the 16th to the 19th century, enslaved Africans endured the horrific journey known as the Middle Passage, a segment of the triangular trade route involving Europe, Africa, and the Americas. On ships bound for the Americas, individuals faced cramped conditions, insufficient food, and widespread disease. Many underwent a dehumaning process called seasoning upon arrival, acquiring new skills and adapting to new names to indicate their enslaved status. Enslaved people lived without legal rights, treated as property rather than human beings. They suffered physical and emotional abuse, including family separation and forced conversion to Christianity, with Europeans imposing their beliefs to justify the enslavement. Efforts to end this brutal practice spanned several centuries, with the UK banning the slave trade in 1807 and abolishing slavery in its colonies in 1833. The U.S. proclaimed enslaved people in the Confederate territory free in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, and Brazil abolished slavery all the way in 1888.